Now, so what is modern history doing? They're not doing that. They have the Ramesses Exodus Theory, and it's based on a passage from the Bible where it said that the children of Israel were oppressed. They arose of Pharaoh, did not know Joseph, and they were put to work. They were enslaved to build the treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. Now, Pi means the estate. So we're talking about the estate of Pharaoh Thom and Pharaoh Ramses. Nobody mentions Pharaoh Thom because they're focused on Ramses. So therefore they say Ramses is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Yeah, sounds plausible, but not really. Because if Ramses was they were building the city of Ramses, it says in the Bible, many generations passed under the oppression, and they still waxed mightier and mightier. And then Moses was born, and then he fled, and then he came back at the age of 80. Good, 80, to free the Israelites from Pharaoh Ramses, who's now about 200 years old. Doesn't make much sense, does it? This is an anachronism. It is very common in the Bible and in other historical writing. The name, of course, after it became the royal city of Ramses, they always used that name from them on. They no longer use the city of Avarice anymore, which is what this is. So when the Bible was written down, they call it Pi-Ramses. It's purely an anachronism. Right? That does not make the Bible invalid. You just have to watch out for anachronisms. It says Moses married an Ethiopian woman. In Hebrew it says he married a Cushite. But the term Ethiopia didn't show up until 1,000 years later in the writings of Herodotus. So he did not marry an Ethiopian woman. There were no Ethiopians back then. It's an anachronism. So when Julius Caesar crossed the English Channel in 50 AD to invade Britain, there was no England, so there was no English Channel. But who cares what the Celts called it? Do you care? I don't care. He crossed the English Channel. I'm fine with that. But just remember, it's an anachronism. Adjust for it. So the Exodus must have happened in the 13th century, not the 15th century, because they know when Ramses II, Ramses the Great, we know when he reigned. And besides, we've all seen the movie, so it must be that way. Okay, so that's where they start from. Now this is where they go with it. They have done a lot of archaeology in Egypt and in Israel during that 13th century period, and there is nothing to show the presence of Semitic Israelites or Canaanites in Egypt at that time. There is nothing to show the conquest and the destruction of the cities in the Bible that they speaks about in Israel at that time in the 13th century. In fact, Jericho wasn't even inhabited. So you can imagine what conventional historians say. They get very derisive. So the miracle is that the Israelites conquered a city that wasn't even inhabited, Jericho. So they get very, very derisive about it. Okay, well, remember they set this up. The biblical chronology doesn't say that. It says the Exodus was 1447, and they entered into Israel 40 years later, around 1400. That's great. It's the conquest. So they have rejected the Bible as a reliable version of history. Didn't happen. The Bible is not a story of anyone's past. Certainly not the Israelites. So that's all rejected because of this. So that's an anachronism, the city of Ramses. Now, I want to introduce you to what we call a logic table here. A logic table. If that were the city of Ramses, he could not be the Pharaoh of the Exodus, right? Because the Exodus came later, much later. Okay, so if it is an anachronism, all bets are off. Ramses came later. The Exodus came later. Heck, he might be. Also Tom, he came later. The Exodus came later. He might be a candidate. The reason we reject Ramses is because we know when Ramses lived. And the Egyptian records say he died in his bed of old age. What happened to the died at the Red Sea thing? They can just discard that because the Bible is not a reliable history. Ramses, he did a campaign into Canaan much later than the Exodus. But if you're a conventional chronologist, you can just ignore all this, because whenever you see people ignoring evidence like this, there's an agenda behind it. What do you think that agenda could be? Why would we ignore all of this evidence? Because this evidence validates the Bible, and the agenda is to disprove the Bible. So we'll ignore that, and anything we don't like that goes against our theory. So let's go back to Solomon's son was Rehoboam, and in the 5th year of his reign, the Egyptian Pharaoh Shishak sacked Jerusalem. He sacked Jerusalem and took away all the treasures of the house of the Lord that his father had done. Ramesses II was the Shishak of the Bible. Now this has further been sort of scrambled up, if you will, by Jean-Francois Champollion, who was a believer, an incredible intellectual who cracked the code of the hieroglyphs. It was a dead language for almost 2,000 years. He was the one who wrongly equated the Pharaoh Shoshenq with the Shishak of the Bible, that it says sacked Jerusalem in 925. And then he traveled to Egypt in 1829 to really see if his code breaking was working. And so in the temple at Karnak, where they have just a vast temple complex, they have a part of the wall that is dedicated to Shoshenq's campaign, and he read off the names of all these Old Testament cities: Ajalon, Gibeon, Megiddo, and so he's really excited. Now this was in the day when not only did they believe in the Bible, but they were going to do anything they could to twist the truth to make it fit into the Bible narrative. Now neither one of these extremes well serves the cause of truth. Don't try and make it fit. Truth is going to fit. Okay, so he saw Shoshenq up on the wall. He said, Shoshenq, Shishak, you got to admit it's close, right? This must be the Pharaoh of the Bible they're talking about. In reality, they were two different pharaohs. They both campaigned in Canaan, two different campaigns for two different purposes, and we have the record of it. I'm not going out on a limb. This is absolute historical fact. You can argue whether Ramesses is really Shishak or not, but I think that's very well established by David Rohl, that indeed that was his abbreviated name. It's called a hypochoristicon. You can think of it as a nickname if you want, but it's more formal than that. They would actually use that to refer to them, because their real name was like a paragraph long. And really, all their titles and everything, it's ridiculous. So they would have a hypochoristicon. Tiglath-Pileser was called Pul in the Bible. And Ramesses is Shishak. He is the Shishak of the Bible. So Champollion was very excited about this, and then he came to the last glyph, and it said, Yudah HaMalkut, Judah the kingdom. Here it is, the link to the Bible, absolute proof. Well, he got that wrong. He just mistranslated that particular glyph. It actually said Yad HaMelech, the hand of the king, which was an outpost near Megiddo. It didn't say Judah the kingdom. Because you notice in that, they never even went to Jerusalem. Jerusalem's not in that list. So this wasn't the conqueror of Jerusalem, was it? Right. Okay, so he just messed it up because he was really trying so hard to make it fit the Bible that he just made a simple mistake that has been corrected. So Shoshenq I was the first ruler of the 22nd dynasty. So we're back to the conventional chronology. So he was the first ruler of the 22nd dynasty of the 20th, 21st, and 19th dynasties would all be butted up to him. We got the king list, just count back, right? Count back to the 19th dynasty, less the 5 kings of the 19th dynasty, plus the 66 years of Ramesses II's reign to arrive at 1279 for his reign. That must be when the Exodus was. Proof positive from the Bible. From the Bible. That the Exodus was actually in the 13th century rather than the 15th century, going completely against the biblical chronology. Well, he had it wrong. It reads Yad HaMelech, the hand of the king, an outpost near Megiddo. Shoshenq is not Shishak. Can you say that out loud? Shoshenq is not Shishak. You're going to get slapped in the face with this stuff. And you may well encounter somebody who actually knows some archaeological data, and they will cite facts and figures to you, right? So you need to be able to remember, Shoshenq is not Shishak. That was a misidentification. And then they will start to sputter. Okay, so the Ramesses Exodus Theory was born and justified using Bible passages that go completely against the biblical chronology. There's nothing wrong with the methodology they use counting back through the king list. It's simply the misidentification of Shoshenq with Shishak that's the problem. 2 different campaigns, 2 different pharaohs. Look at the 2 campaigns. They don't intersect at all. Shishak went to Jerusalem. Shoshenq, there's no overlap in these at all. In fact, you can look at the map, and I want you to look at the little yellow area on the map on the right-hand side. That is the area of the map on the left. That's Shishak's campaign. Shoshenq's campaign was up in the north. And we know when Shoshenq lived. So it even says this on the temple walls at Karnak, at the Ramesseum, which was the part that was devoted to Ramses' exploits. It says, the town which the king, Ramses, plundered in year 8, Shalem, or Salem. Salem was the ancient name used in the Bible for Jerusalem. Be careful about standing in the way of theorists when they're on a roll. They're just not interested in facts. You know, they know what they want to say and they're going to say it. So Solomon died in the year 930. Jerusalem was sacked 5 years later after his death. Ramses campaigned in his 8th year. He died in his bed, not at the Red Sea. Ramses was not the Pharaoh of the Exodus. We know that. So, and we'll talk about who is. So we talked about King Ahab, because here I'm going to show you we actually know when Shoshenq reigned also. So we know he was. We know when his campaign was, and he was not the Shishak of the Bible. Ahab was reigning at the time of Tiglath-Pileser, who received tribute from Shephet-Baal of Byblos and Jehoahaz of Juhad. So we know these guys. We know when they reigned. So you see Shephet-Baal down at the bottom. Those are the kings of Byblos on the left. That's their Egyptian overlords on the right. The bottom one, Tiglath-Pileser, is actually Assyrian. And the years they reigned. So we can link these together. So remember Jerusalem was sacked in 925. He reigned, Shoshenq I reigned 130 years later. He was not the Pharaoh. Shoshenq is not Shishak. Can you say that? Not Shishak. So they're wrong about that. The Ramesses Exodus Theory is a complete mirage. So you need to know that in your heart. And then, of course, buy the book so you can prove it to people that doubt your word. Now, this was covered very, very well in the first film by Tim Mahoney, Evidence of the Exodus. He did a masterful job of covering the chronology. And one of the things that's interesting, Dennis Prager made a really insightful comment. He said, why do historians insist we look in a period where there is no evidence of the Exodus, instead of in the biblical chronology where there is evidence? That's what they're trying to do, bait and switch. Insisting you must look in the 13th century for evidence of the Exodus. There is none, which disproves the Bible. Don't fall for that. The biblical chronology is the correct one, and I think we've amply demonstrated that using anchor points, fixed dates in history, and synchronized king lists. Would you agree? Right, that is scientific. That's the scientific way to go about it. The new chronology is come up with by David Roll, by the way, and many of you know him. And remember, he's not a believer. He's a great guy. He has a sincere respect for religion, but he did not start out to prove the biblical chronology was correct. He saw that there were problems in the Egyptian chronology upon which all ancient history is based, and he set out to fix that, and having found the problems and fixed them, he discovered, well, now the biblical chronology is right on. It works. And so they have used the Bible to disprove the Bible. Circular arguments. Circular arguments.